At 5:07 p.m., Lorain, Ohio, was a booming lakeside town celebrating the weekend. The streets were full, the theaters were packed, the factories were humming with the sound of American industry. By 5:09 p.m., it was a graveyard. This is the story of the deadliest minute in Ohio history. A single minute where the clock didn't just stop, it was smashed into oblivion. We tend to think of weather as something gradual. We watch the radar. We get the push notification on our phones. We hear the siren wail, and we have 10, maybe 15 minutes to grab the dog and get to the basement. We have the luxury of fear. But in 1924, fear was a luxury they couldn't afford because they didn't know it was coming. On June 28, 1924, a monster didn't just survive the crossing of Lake Erie, it grew. It defied physics, it defied meteorology, and it was aiming for a building packed with 200 children watching a matinee. This wasn't just a storm, it was a predator. And to understand how a city of thousands was brought to its knees in less time than it takes to smoke a cigarette, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the wind, before the rain, back when the only danger in the air was the heat. Welcome to the story of the Lorain-Sandusky tornado, the 28th of June, 1924. If you were to step out onto Broadway in Lorain that morning, the first thing that would hit you wouldn't be the wind. It would be the air itself. It was heavy, thick, the kind of humidity that feels like a wet wool blanket wrapped around your chest. It was the Roaring Twenties, and nowhere was roaring quite like northern Ohio. This was the industrial heartland of America. The steel mills were burning coal 24/7. The shipyards were launching massive freighters into the Great Lakes. The economy was booming, and on a Saturday, the pockets of the workers were full of cash. Lorain was a city on the rise. It was a place where immigrants from all over Europe came to stake their claim on the American dream. They worked hard in the steel plants during the week, and on Saturdays, they lived. But on this particular Saturday, the living was hard. A massive warm front had stalled over the Ohio Valley. It trapped the moisture from the Gulf of Mexico, pressing it down against the cool air rising off Lake Erie. It created a pressure cooker. Newspapers from that day described the heat as oppressive, suffocating. People were desperate for relief. They flocked to the beaches at Lakeview Park. They packed into the local bathhouses to soak in the cool lake water. And, crucially, they sought refuge in the one place that promised a break from the sweltering sun, the movie theaters. The State Theater, the Palace, these were the cathedrals of the modern age, dark, cool, ventilated. Families sent their children there to get them out of the house. Husbands took their wives there for a reprieve from the stifling apartments. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. Or so they thought. See, what they couldn't see, what no one could see, was what was happening 5,000 feet above their heads. The atmosphere was becoming what meteorologists call a loaded gun. You have this layer of hot, moist air sitting near the ground. Above it, a layer of cold, dry air is trying to push down. Usually, these layers mix gradually, but sometimes a cap forms, a lid on the pot. The heat builds and builds and builds, trapped underneath, until the energy becomes so volatile that it doesn't just release, it explodes. That is what was happening over northern Ohio. The sky was literally boiling, but down on the street, it was just a hot day. There was no Doppler radar, no satellite imagery, no National Weather Service alerts scrolling across a television screen. In 1924, weather forecasting was essentially a guessing game played with barometers and telegraphs. The forecasters in Cleveland saw the heat. They saw the humidity. They predicted showers and thunderstorms. Showers. That was the official word. So, the people of Lorain went about their Saturday. They bought their tickets. They went to the beach. They walked the boardwalks. They had absolutely no idea that 40 miles to the west, the gun was about to go off. Now, before we look at the moment of impact, I want to ask you a question. How much do you trust the safety of your own home? When you lock the door at night, you feel safe. When you walk into a sturdy brick building, you feel protected. We have a fundamental belief that our structures, our cities, are permanent, that they can withstand the elements, but history is a long list of reminders that we are wrong, because what happened in Lorain wasn't just a tragedy, it was a crime scene, and Mother Nature was the perpetrator. Let's move the clock forward. It is now 3 p.m. The heat is peaking. The temperature is hovering near 90 degrees, but the humidity makes it feel closer to 100. To the west, near the city of Sandusky, the sky is beginning to change. Witnesses later reported that the blue sky didn't turn gray. It didn't turn black. It turned a sickly, bruised shade of yellow. Then, greenish purple. This is a color that triggers a primal instinct in anyone who grew up in Tornado Alley. It's the color of hail. It's the color of sunlight refracting through millions of gallons of water suspended in the air. It's the color of violence. At 3:30 p.m., the barometer began to plummet. A cold front from the north was finally smashing into that stalled warm front. The cap broke. The loaded gun fired. Massive supercell thunderstorms exploded upward, piercing the stratosphere. These weren't normal thunderheads. These were rotating updrafts, what we call mesocyclones. Inside these clouds, the wind was doing something terrifying. It was changing direction with height. At the surface, the wind was coming from the southeast. A few thousand feet up, it was coming from the west. This shear caused the air to roll like a horizontal tube. And then, the updraft grabbed that tube and tilted it vertical. The storm began to spin. At 4 p.m., just outside of Sandusky, Ohio, a finger of God descended. It didn't look like the classic tornadoes you see in movies. It wasn't a slender, graceful rope. It was a jagged, messy, debris-filled wedge, and it touched down right in the heart of the industrial chaos. The first thing it hit was a series of factories and train tracks. Imagine the sound. This is 1,924. There are steam engines. There are massive coal piles. There are brick chimneys standing 100 feet tall. The tornado tore through them as if they were made of wet cardboard. Freight trains, weighing hundreds of tons, were lifted off their tracks and thrown into nearby fields. Chimneys collapsed, crushing the workers inside. In Sandusky, the world ended in seconds. 8 people died almost instantly. The confusion was absolute. Telephone lines were snapped. The telegraph poles were down. Sandusky was effectively cut off from the world. They couldn't call for help. And more importantly, they couldn't call ahead to warn anyone else. This is a critical point in the timeline. While Sandusky was digging its dead out of the rubble, while men were screaming for help from under piles of bricks, the people in Lorain, just 25 miles to the east, were still sweating. They were still laughing. The matinee at the State Theater was just starting. They couldn't hear the screams. They couldn't see the devastation. Ignorance was total. But the storm wasn't done with Sandusky. It was just getting started. It chewed through the north side of the city, leaving a scar of total destruction. Houses were leveled. Trees were stripped of their bark, a sign of immense wind speed, likely exceeding 200 miles per hour. And then, it did something that gave the people of Sandusky a moment of hope. It headed for the water. It moved northeast, reaching the shoreline of Sandusky Bay and the open expanse of Lake Erie. Now, conventional wisdom, even back in 1924, said that tornadoes die over water. The logic is simple. Tornadoes need heat. They need friction. They need the warm, unstable air rising off the land to fuel their engines. The water of Lake Erie, even in June, is relatively cool. It's a heat sink. It stabilizes the air. When a tornado hits a large body of cool water, it should choke. It should lose its energy. It should dissipate into a harmless rain shower. People watching from the ruined streets of Sandusky watched the funnel move out over the bay. They saw it turning into a gray mist. They probably thought, thank God, it's over. It's going to die out there. They were wrong. The storm didn't die. It evolved. As it moved over the water, the funnel widened. It stopped sucking up dirt and debris and started sucking up water. Millions of tons of it. It transformed from a dirty, black wedge into a ghostly white pillar of spray. And here is the terrifying part. Because the friction over water is lower than over land, the wind speeds actually times increased asterisk. The storm became smoother, faster, more efficient. It was no longer just a tornado. It was a waterspout of nightmare proportions, a hydra of wind and water, churning across the lake, hidden inside a curtain of rain. And it wasn't moving randomly. It was moving east, directly toward the smokestacks of Lorain. Let's pause the timeline here for a second. 4:30 p.m. The storm is now out over the lake. If you were a fisherman on Lake Erie that day, you would have seen something that looked like the end of the world, a wall of water connecting the sky to the waves. But in Lorain, on the shore, the view was different. Because of the angle, because of the rain. They couldn't see the funnel. All they saw was a dark storm front approaching from the west. Just a thunderstorm, they said. Maybe it'll cool things off. Maybe it'll break the heat. This is the tragedy of the pre-radar era. The threat was visible, but it was disguised. It was wearing a mask of rain. In the downtown district of Lorain, the manager of the State Theater was checking the ticket sales. It was a full house. Kids were packed into the front rows, staring up at the silent, flickering screen. Parents were in the balcony. Outside, the streetcars were running up and down Broadway. Shoppers were ducking into stores to avoid the coming rain. There was a strange stillness in the air. The birds had stopped singing. The wind, which had been gusty, suddenly died down. It was the deep breath before the scream. At the Coast Guard station near the harbor, the lookout squinted through his binoculars. He saw the darkness out on the lake. He saw the waves churning. But he didn't sound the alarm. Why would he? It was just a squall. He didn't know that inside that squall was a meat grinder. He didn't know that the storm had merged with a second funnel cloud over the water, absorbing its energy, becoming a singular, massive engine of destruction. It traveled 25 miles over the open water, 25 miles of silence, 25 miles of gathering strength. It was a stealth bomber made of air, and at 5 p.m. it began to turn. It stopped moving parallel to the coast and turned its eye directly inland, toward the bathhouse, toward the park, toward the downtown grid. The people of Lorain looked up at the sky. They saw the clouds turning a color they had never seen before, a deep, bruising purple. Some of them felt their ears pop. The pressure was dropping so fast it was physically painful, and then they heard it. It didn't sound like thunder. Thunder rumbles, thunder cracks. This was a continuous, low-frequency roar, a vibration that you felt in your teeth before you heard it with your ears. Witnesses later said it sounded like 1,000 freight trains crossing a trestle bridge. Others said it sounded like the earth itself was grinding its gears. But by the time they identified the sound, it was too late to run. The monster was at the door. At 5:05 p.m., the storm crossed the shoreline at Lakeview Park. The bathhouse was full of people changing out of their swimsuits. Families were picnicking on the grass. The wind hit them first. Not a gust, but a wall. Trees were snapped in half instantly. The roof of the bathhouse was peeled back like the lid of a sardine can. People were sucked out of the building, thrown into the lake, thrown into the trees. The sand from the beach was whipped up into a abrasive cloud that stripped the paint off of cars. But the storm didn't stop at the park. It didn't slow down. It accelerated. It roared over the residential streets, turning wooden homes into splinters. It chewed a path of absolute ruin, 300 yards wide, heading straight for the heart of the city, straight for Broadway, straight for the State Theater. It is 5:07 p.m. The people inside the theater are laughing at a comedy on the screen. The projectionist is adjusting the reel. Outside, the sky has turned pitch black. The roar is deafening now. It drowns out the streetcars. It drowns out the screams. The clock is ticking. Tick, tick, tick. And then the lights went out. The lights went out. Inside the State Theater, for a fraction of a second, there was confusion. A collective murmur. Is it a fuse? Is it the projector? But that confusion didn't last long enough to turn into a question, because in the dark, the sound arrived. It wasn't the sound of wind. We need to be very clear about this. Wind whistles, wind howls. This was a physical weight. It was a grinding, mechanical roar that vibrated the floorboards beneath their feet. It shook the velvet seats. It rattled the fillings in their teeth. Imagine being inside a wooden crate and placing that crate on the tracks directly in front of a speeding locomotive. That is what 5:08 p.m. sounded like. The air pressure inside the theater dropped so violently that people's ears popped. The air was suddenly sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum that felt like a punch to the chest. And then, the building began to scream. Not the people, the building. The massive steel trusses holding up the roof, the bricks making up the walls. They groaned under the torture of a 200-mile-per-hour twisting force. The walls didn't just blow in. They breathed. They flexed. And then, with a sound like a gunshot that cracked the eardrums of everyone inside, The roof failed. Gravity. We forget about gravity. We fight it every day, but we forget how patient it is. It waits. It waits for a mistake. It waits for a weakness. When the tornado stripped the roof off the State Theater, gravity saw its chance. Tons of steel, slate, plaster, and timber. The entire ceiling of the auditorium detached. It didn't float down. It didn't drift. It slammed down. It fell directly onto the balcony. The balcony was packed. Families, teenagers, couples on dates. The weight of the collapsing roof crushed the balcony down onto the main floor. The mezzanine collapsed onto the stalls. It was a pancake collapse. A cascading failure of structural integrity. In 1 second, just 1 single second, a cathedral of entertainment was transformed into a tomb. And then, silence. Let's slow this down. We need to understand the anatomy of this minute. 5, 8, and 30 seconds. The wind is still screaming outside, but inside the rubble pile, the noise is muffled. It's dark, pitch black, the kind of darkness you can taste. The air is filled with pulverized plaster. It's a thick, white dust that coats the throat. It enters the nose. It clogs the eyes. Survivors later said the first thing they noticed wasn't pain. It was the inability to breathe. They were choking on the building itself. For a moment, nobody screamed. This is a phenomenon often seen in sudden, massive trauma. The brain simply cannot process the shift in reality. One moment you are watching a movie, the next, you are pinned under a concrete slab in total darkness. The brain hits pause. It buffers. There is only the sound of falling dust, the creaking of settling timber. And then, the screaming started. It didn't start all at once. It started with one voice. A child crying out for a mother, then a man shouting a name, then a chorus, a cacophony of terror rising from the dark. I can't move. My legs. My legs. Is anyone there? Please. Inside the State Theater, hundreds of people were trapped in a twisted maze of steel and wood. Some were miraculously untouched. Sitting in void spaces, little pockets of air created where a beam had landed across 2 seats, shielding them from the crushing weight. They sat there, in the dark, terrified to move, hearing the groans of the dying around them. Others were not so lucky. They were pinned, crushed, trapped in positions that the human body was never meant to take. And above them, the storm raged on. We have to zoom out. We have to look at what was happening on Broadway. The tornado didn't stop at the theater. It had an appetite. It moved down the main commercial strip of Lorain with the precision of a surgeon and the brutality of a butcher. Buildings made of solid brick were simply erased. The force of the wind was so intense that it didn't just knock walls down. It disintegrated the mortar. It turned bricks into missiles. Imagine a brick, a solid red clay brick. Now imagine that brick moving at 150 miles per hour. It's not a building material anymore. It's a cannonball. These bricks were flying through the air, punching holes in cars, smashing through storefronts, embedding themselves in telephone poles. A streetcar, a massive iron trolley weighing nearly 20 tons, was lifted off its tracks. 20 tons, lifted. The tornado tossed it aside like a child's toy. It rolled it down the street, crushing anything in its path. The passengers inside were tumbled like clothes in a dryer, battered by broken glass and twisted metal. Automobiles were picked up and thrown into the second stories of buildings. Think about that image. You walk out of your office, you look up, and there is a Ford Model T sticking out of the window of the second floor. The physics required to do that are mind-bending. It requires a vertical lift force that is almost impossible to comprehend. But the tornado wasn't just wind. It was a vacuum. It was sucking the contents of the stores out into the street. Furniture, clothing, cash registers, mannequins. It all joined the debris ball. The air was a blender of glass, wood, and steel. And in the middle of it all, people. People who had been walking home. People who had been window shopping. There was no time to find shelter. If you were on the street at 5-8 p.m., you were at the mercy of chance. Some were picked up and thrown hundreds of yards, landing in piles of debris, miraculously alive. Others were struck by flying timber and killed instantly. One witness described seeing a man holding on to a lamppost. He was holding on with everything he had. The wind was pulling his legs horizontal, and then the lamppost snapped. Let's go back to the water. Remember the bathhouse at Lakeview Park? The first point of impact? By 5:10 p.m., the storm had moved on, but the horror there was unique. The bathhouse was gone, simply gone. But the people had been in their swimsuits. They had no protection, no heavy coats, no layers, just skin against the storm, the sand. We don't think of sand as a weapon, but at 200 miles per hour, sand acts like sandpaper. It acts like a sandblaster. Survivors found on the beach had their skin raw, scoured by the flying grit. They were huddled in the wreckage of the changing rooms, shivering not just from shock, but from the sudden, violent drop in temperature. The lake, which had been a place of joy just 10 minutes ago, was now a churning, gray cauldron. Debris from the city was starting to fall into the water. Pieces of roofs, personal photographs, ticket stubs. The storm was depositing the life of Lorain into Lake Erie, back to the city. 5:12 p.m. The tornado is moving east. It is tearing through the residential districts now. This is where the stories become intimate. In the commercial district, it was about crowds. In the residential district, it was about families. It was Saturday evening. Dinner was being prepared. Mothers were in kitchens. Fathers were reading papers. The roar approached. Houses in Lorain were built strong. They were built for winter, but they were not built for this. When a tornado of this magnitude hits a house, it doesn't just blow it down. It explodes it. The pressure difference is the key. The pressure inside the house is normal. The pressure inside the tornado is remarkably low. When the funnel envelops the house, the high-pressure air inside the house desperately wants to get out. It pushes outward on the walls. It pushes upward on the roof. The house literally bursts. Walls collapse outward. The roof lifts off. The floors pancake. Whole families were buried in their basements. But here is a detail that is often overlooked in disaster stories. The sound of the house dying. Survivors talk about the screaming of the nails. As the wood is twisted, the nails are pulled out of the timber. It creates a high-pitched screeching sound, like 1,000 banshees. That was the last thing many people heard. The screaming of the nails. 5:15 p.m. The tornado has crossed the Black River. It is moving towards the shipyards, the American Shipbuilding Company. This was the pride of Lorain. Massive cranes, huge dry docks, steel freighters under construction. These were structures built to defy the elements. They were built of heavy steel girders, riveted together by men who knew their craft. The tornado didn't care. It hit the shipyards and twisted the cranes like pretzels. It ripped the roofs off the machine shops. It tossed heavy steel plates around like playing cards. But as it crossed the river, something happened. The storm began to lose its focus. It had expended a massive amount of energy, destroying the downtown grid. It had chewed up thousands of tons of debris. Its intake was clogged. The funnel began to lift. It didn't disappear, but it lifted off the ground. It became a high-altitude threat, sparing the eastern suburbs the total annihilation that Broadway had suffered. It moved on towards Cleveland, weakening, dying, turning back into a simple thunderstorm. But behind it, in Lorain, the wind stopped. 5:16 p.m. Silence. This is the most terrifying moment of all. The roar is gone. The freight train has passed, and in its place, absolute, ringing silence. The birds are not singing. The cars are not running. The streetcars are not clanging. For a few seconds, the survivors are too stunned to make a sound. They are lying in the rubble, eyes wide, ears ringing, trying to understand if they are alive or dead. And then, the atmosphere shifted again. The storm had passed, but the weather wasn't done. The heavens opened. Rain, not a gentle shower, a deluge, a torrential, tropical downpour unleashed from the backside of the supercell. And this was the cruelest twist of all. Imagine you are trapped in the basement of your home. The house has collapsed on top of you. You are pinned by a beam. You are alive. You are breathing. But now, water is pouring in. The debris is clogging the drains. The sewers are backed up. The basement is filling up. The panic of the wind is replaced by the panic of the water. Survivors in the rubble of the State Theater felt the rain filtering down through the cracks in the collapsed roof. At first, it was refreshing. Cool water on dust-choked throats. But then, the water mixed with the plaster dust. It turned into a slurry, a heavy, wet mud that coated everything. It made the beams slippery, it made it impossible to grip, and it began to pool in the lower sections of the slanted floor. Those trapped in the lowest parts of the debris pile realized with dawning horror that they weren't just in danger of being crushed, they were in danger of drowning. 5:20 p.m. The city begins to wake up. The people who were on the edges of the path, the ones who had only lost windows or shingles, they stepped out of their doors. They looked toward downtown. They expected to see damage. They expected to see a few trees down. What they saw broke their minds. The city was gone. The skyline of Lorain had been amputated. The familiar shapes of the buildings were missing. In their place were jagged teeth of broken brick. Fires began to break out. Gas lines had been severed. Live electrical wires were dancing in the wet streets, sparking and hissing. The smell of natural gas began to drift through the ruins. A sickly, sweet smell that signaled a new danger. If a spark hit a pocket of gas, the rubble piles would turn into ovens. The first responders weren't the police. They weren't the fire department. Their stations had been hit. Their trucks were buried. The first responders were the survivors. Fathers dug for their children with bare hands. Shopkeepers dug for their customers. Strangers dug for strangers. They tore at the bricks until their fingernails broke. They lifted beams that should have been too heavy for human muscles to move. Adrenaline is a powerful drug. At the State Theater, the scene was chaotic. The entrance was blocked. The marquee was twisted into a heap of metal. People were spilling out of the side exits, the ones who could walk. They were covered in white dust, looking like ghosts. They were bleeding. They were stumbling. "There are people in there," someone screamed. "The balcony fell. They're trapped." Men from the street ran toward the theater. They grabbed pry bars. They grabbed shovels. They entered the dark auditorium. They had no flashlights. They had only matches and lighters, which they were terrified to use because of the gas. So they listened. They listened to the voices in the dark. "Over here! Help me! Mommy!" The rescuers crawled into the voids. They squeezed through gaps in the concrete. They found scenes of horror that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They found the projectionist, dead in his booth, still clutching the controls. They found people sitting in their seats, looking perfectly normal, until you realized they weren't breathing. The pressure change had killed them instantly, without a mark on their bodies. They found a man holding his wife's hand, but his wife was buried under a ton of slate. He wouldn't let go. He refused to leave her. We need to pause and understand the scale of this. This wasn't just a building collapse. This was a mass casualty event in a confined space. The rescuers were working blind. They were working in the rain. They were working with the fear that the rest of the building could come down at any second. Every time they moved a beam, the pile shifted. Every time the pile shifted, someone screamed. It was a game of Jenga played with human lives, and outside, the chaos was just as bad. Looting is an ugly word. We don't like to talk about it. We like to think that, in disasters, everyone comes together, and mostly, they do. But in 1924, in the darkness and confusion, there were shadows moving in the ruins. People were seen climbing through broken store windows, not to help, but to take. Jewelry stores had been ripped open. Cash registers were lying in the street. Human nature is a spectrum. On one end, you have the man lifting a beam off a stranger. On the other end, you have the man stealing a watch from a body. The National Guard hadn't arrived yet. The police were overwhelmed. Lorain was lawless. Let's look at the tick-tock again. It is 5:30 p.m., 22 minutes since impact. The shock is starting to wear off. The pain is setting in. The hospitals, Street Josephs, are starting to receive the first wave. But the ambulances can't get through. The streets are blocked by fallen trees, smashed cars, and mountains of brick, so the wounded are being carried. On doors ripped from hinges, on ironing boards, in the backs of surviving delivery trucks, they are walking wounded. A parade of misery stumbling toward help. Doctors and nurses are working by lantern light because the power is out citywide. They are stitching wounds without anesthesia. They are setting bones on the hallway floors. The magnitude of the disaster is overwhelming the system. Back at the theater, the rescue effort is becoming desperate. They can hear voices deep in the pile, voices that are getting quieter. The air is running out in the pockets. The weight is compressing chests. A group of men, shipyard workers, strong men with calloused hands, organize a bucket brigade, not for water, but for bricks. They form a line into the dark maw of the theater. They pass bricks hand to hand, one by one, clearing a path. They are digging a tunnel into the center of the collapse. They are following the sound of a child crying. Let me paint a picture for you of a specific moment, a moment recorded in the diaries of the time. A man is walking down Broadway. He is covered in dust. He is holding a singular shoe, a woman's high-heeled shoe. He is stopping every person he sees. Have you seen her? He asks. She was wearing this. He doesn't know where he is going. He is in shock. He is walking in circles. This is the face of the aftermath. It isn't the statistics. It isn't the F4 rating. It is a man with a shoe, standing in the rain, surrounded by the ruins of his life. The storm lasted maybe 3 minutes. The tornado was in the city for maybe 5. But in those 5 minutes, it undid 50 years of history. It orphaned children. It widowed wives. It erased fortunes. And as the sun began to set on the 28th of June 1924, as the true darkness of night began to fall over a city without electricity, the real terror was just beginning, because they knew that under the bricks, under the timber, their friends and neighbors were still waiting, and the silence of the night was about to be filled with the sounds of the dig. The sun went down on Saturday, June 28th, but darkness had fallen on Lorain hours before. Now, the city entered a different kind of night. A night without streetlights, without electricity, without the comforting hum of the 20th century. It was a night lit only by the flickering yellow beams of kerosene lanterns, the headlights of the few surviving automobiles, and the eerie, dancing glow of gas fires smoldering in the ruins. If Act 1 was about the tension, and Act 2 was about the terror, Act 3 is about the endurance, because the storm was gone, but the suffering was just beginning. Imagine the soundscape of that night. It wasn't silent. It was a chaotic symphony of human effort. The clink, clink, clink of shovels hitting brick, the grinding of saws cutting through timber, the shouts of men coordinating lift teams. Heave. 1, 2, heave. And underneath it all, the relentless patter of the rain, washing the blood into the gutters. The National Guard arrived shortly after midnight. They didn't come as rescuers initially. They came as enforcers. Governor Donahue had declared martial law. Lorain was now a controlled zone. Bayonets were fixed. Orders were shouted. Halt! Who goes there? The soldiers patrolled the perimeter of the downtown district. Their job was grim but necessary. They had to stop the looting. They had to stop the sightseers. They had to secure the banks where vaults lay exposed to the open air. But mostly, they were there to guard the dead. Bodies were being pulled from the wreckage at a rate that overwhelmed the undertakers. Makeshift morgues were set up in garages, in school gymnasiums, in the back rooms of stores that still had a roof. The identification process was heartbreaking. In 1924, there were no DNA tests, no dental records on a central database. Family members had to walk down rows of covered forms. They had to lift the sheets. They had to look at faces that were bruised, swollen, and covered in gray dust. They looked for rings. They looked for birthmarks. They looked for the clothes they had ironed that morning. This ritual went on all night. At the State Theater, the rescue effort had turned into a marathon. The men digging in the pile were exhausted. Their hands were raw. Their backs were screaming. But nobody stopped. They knew that time was the enemy. Every hour that passed, the chance of finding someone alive in the voids dropped. Hypothermia was setting in. The rain was cold. The shock was lethal. And then, a miracle. Deep in the rubble, a sound. Not a scream. A tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was the universal code of the trapped miner, the signal of life in the dark. The rescuers froze. "Quiet!" someone roared. Everyone shut up. The silence fell over the site. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from beneath the balcony section. The digging frenzied. They moved with renewed purpose. They used automobile jacks to lift a massive slab of concrete. They shored it up with timber. A man squeezed into the gap. And there, huddled in a small triangle of space created by a fallen beam, was a young couple. They were terrified. They were dehydrated. But they were alive. As they were pulled out into the night air, into the glare of the headlights, A cheer went up from the crowd. It was a ragged, exhausted cheer, but it was a sound of victory in a night of defeat. They weren't the only ones. Throughout the night, sporadic miracles occurred. A child found wrapped in a theater curtain, a man found shielded by a row of seats. But for every miracle, there were 10 tragedies. By dawn, the death toll was climbing past 50. It would eventually settle at over 80, with thousands injured. Sunday morning, June 29th. The sun rose over Lake Erie. It was a beautiful, clear morning. The sky was a brilliant, innocent blue. Nature, having thrown its tantrum, was now pretending nothing had happened. But as the light hit the city of Lorain, the true scale of the devastation was finally visible. It looked, and this is a quote from a World War I veteran who was there, "It looked like E-Press. It looked like the Western Front. The downtown district wasn't just damaged, it was pulverized. We need to visualize this. It wasn't just that the roofs were gone, it was that the second floors of buildings were gone, while the first floors remained, filled with rubble. It looked like a giant hand had simply swiped the top half of the city off the map. Cars were found wrapped around telephone poles like aluminum foil. A piece of a roof from the State Theater was found miles away. And there were the oddities, the strange, physics-defying signatures of a tornado, a piece of straw driven into a telephone pole, a house that was completely leveled, except for a kitchen table that was still set for dinner, the plates undisturbed, a calendar on a wall, ripped away to show the date, June 28th. These images were captured by photographers who flocked to the scene. Their black and white photos, grainy and stark, are the reason we can tell this story today. They documented the fragility of our existence. Now, we need to shift gears. We need to put on our detective hats, because once the shock wore off, the questions began. How? How did a tornado cross Lake Erie? How did it kill so many people in brick buildings? This is where we need to look at the science. So, let's solve the water mystery. As we mentioned in Act 1, tornadoes are supposed to die over cool water. They need heat. But on the 28th of June, 1924, Lake Erie wasn't just cool water. The winter of 1923 to 1924 had been mild. The spring had been warm. The water temperature of the lake was higher than average. But more importantly, it was about the time's dew point asterisk. The air sitting just above the lake surface was incredibly saturated. It was 100% humidity. When the tornado moved off the land and onto the water, it didn't lose its fuel source. It just switched fuel sources. Instead of feeding on the thermal bubbles rising from the hot ground, it fed on the massive moisture content available over the lake. Moisture is energy. When water vapor condenses into liquid water, it releases heat. This is called latent heat of condensation. The tornado over Lake Erie was a latent heat engine. It was sucking up that moisture-rich air, condensing it instantly in the funnel, and using that heat release to power the wind. It essentially created its own environment. It carried its own fuel tank across the water. And because there was almost zero friction on the smooth lake surface, the wind speeds accelerated. It became a super-efficient machine. Then, there is the second factor, the merge. Eyewitness reports from the lighthouse keepers and ship captains suggest that the Sandusky tornado didn't cross alone. It likely merged with a second waterspout or satellite funnel over the lake. When two vortices merge, the conservation of angular momentum can cause a temporary but massive spike in intensity. It's like a figure skater pulling their arms in. They spin faster. The storm that hit Lorain was likely in the middle of this intensification cycle, right as it made landfall. It was the worst possible timing. If it had hit 5 minutes later, or 5 minutes earlier, the dynamics might have been different, but it hit right at the peak of its new power cycle. Now, let's look at the buildings. Why did so many die in the State Theater? It was a brick building. It should have been safe. But 1922's construction had a fatal flaw. The walls were unreinforced masonry. Basically, they were bricks, stacked on top of bricks, held together by mortar. They were great at holding up weight. They were terrible at handling side-to-side, shaking, or pulling forces. When the wind pushed against the side of the theater, the walls didn't bend. They cracked. And because the roof trusses were heavy steel, sitting on top of these brittle walls, as soon as the walls shifted, the trusses lost their support. The roof didn't blow times off asterisk. It fell times in asterisk. This is a critical distinction. In modern tornado-safe construction, we tie the roof to the walls with hurricane straps. We use steel rebar inside the concrete blocks. We make the building a single, tied-together unit. In 1924, the building was a house of cards. A strong house of cards, but a house of cards nonetheless. The people in the theater weren't killed by the wind. They were killed by the architecture. Let's return to the human element. The legacy. The funerals began on Monday and didn't stop for a week. Lorain became a city of black veils. Every church was full. Every cemetery was busy. The procession of hearses down Broadway, winding through the cleared paths in the rubble, was a sight that burned itself into the collective memory of the Midwest. But in the midst of this grief, something remarkable happened. The shipyard spirit. Lorain was a tough town. It was a town of welders, riveters, and laborers. These were people who knew how to build things. They didn't wait for the government to save them. They didn't wait for insurance checks. They just started working. On Tuesday, the steel mills reopened. The men went to work. Why? Because the city needed steel to rebuild. On Wednesday, the shipyards were back in operation. Store owners whose buildings were flattened set up tents on the sidewalk. They put up hand-painted signs, "Open for business." They sold bread. They sold nails. They sold boots. It was a defiant act. It was a message to the universe. You can knock us down, but you cannot wipe us out. The State Theater itself became a symbol of this resilience. Looking at the ruins, most people would have said, "Tear it down, build a parking lot, it's a graveyard." But the owner said no. He said, "We will rebuild." And they did. They cleared the rubble. They salvaged the steel that could be saved. And they built a new theater on the exact same spot. When it reopened, it wasn't just a movie theater. It was a monument. Going to the movies in Lorain became an act of remembrance. Every time the lights went down, every time the screen flickered to life, the people in those seats were reclaiming the space that had been taken from them. The investigation into the disaster changed meteorology forever. The Weather Bureau was forced to confront its failures. They realized that showers was not an acceptable forecast for an F4 tornado. It kick-started the push for better observation networks. It led to the understanding of the lake breeze boundary and how it interacts with severe storms. Scientists began to study the specific aerodynamics of waterspouts transitioning to land. The deaths in Lorain were not in vain. They purchased knowledge. They purchased safety for the future. Today, if a storm like that formed over Sandusky, the sirens in Lorain would be wailing 20 minutes before impact. The Doppler radar would show the hook echo. The warning would be precise. Tornado on the ground, moving east at 40 miles per hour. We have that technology because we learned from the blood spilled on Broadway. As we come to the end of this story, I want you to look at the final image. Imagine standing on the pier in Lorain today. It's a peaceful spot. The lighthouse which survived the storm still stands guard. The lake is calm, lapping gently against the breakwall. Fishermen are casting their lines. Kids are playing in the new Lakeview Park. It's hard to believe that this same water, this same sky, once conspired to create a monster. But if you walk into town, if you look closely at the older buildings, you can still see the scars. You can see where the brickwork changes color, marking where the walls were rebuilt. You can see the empty gaps in the streetscape where a building used to be and was never replaced. And if you talk to the old-timers, the children of the survivors, they will tell you about the sound. They will tell you that their grandfathers never liked the wind, that their grandmothers would go pale whenever the sky turned that specific shade of bruised purple. The trauma of 1924 is woven into the DNA of the city, but so is the strength. The Lorain-Sandusky tornado was a tragedy of timing. It was a perfect storm in the truest sense of the word, a rare, unhappy alignment of heat, moisture, wind shear, and human vulnerability. It reminds us that we live on a planet that is wild. We build our walls, we pave our roads, we pretend that we are in control, but every now and then, the atmosphere reminds us of the truth. We are guests here. And on a hot Saturday in June, 100 years ago, the landlord came to collect. The clock struck 5:08, and the world changed. But the clock kept ticking. The sun rose the next day. The city stood back up, and that is the real story. Not the wind, not the destruction, but the moment after the silence, when the first shovel hit the dirt and the digging began.